So would you mind introducing yourself and tell us who you are, what you do, what you did, and why you're here?
My name is Dee Holmes, and I live in Arizona. I work for a too-big-to-fail bank, and I work on the technology side investigating system failures. I came to Arizona by way of California, Utah, and Texas, and back in the dark ages, I was once a lawyer. I came here because I was interested in finding out more about the Kent Hovind case and actually observing Kent and his co-defendant Paul Hansen on the stand.
And what was the big news that we just learned a few hours ago?
I'm going to be disappointed because I am not going to be able to see Kent and Paul on the stand. The government has decided to drop the conspiracy to commit mail fraud and the mail fraud charges, and I was really looking forward to see how the government was going to handle that case.
Myself and my team were here for the first trial. The government's case, the way it was presented, was quite impressive, very thorough, very intense, very technology intensive. The Hansen's defense and Hovind's defense were interested and spirited, and in their own way persuasive. But it certainly seemed that many people I know who were supporters of Kent Hovind and some of those who were more skeptical thought that this time the government was going to win its case. So do you have any idea why on a Sunday night the government decided to drop charges without prejudice except for the contempt charge which Hovind was already convicted of?
Well, I think what happened was that quite recently, in the past week, what had happened was that the two attorneys representing Kent, well, one of them, Kent, that would be his attorney, Thomas Keith, and Hansen's auxiliary counsel, and that would be Chris Klotz. They had both filed motions to dismiss. These motions were apparently based on some briefings provided to them by the U.S. Justice Foundation, and those briefings pointed out some small errors or possible errors in the way the charge had been written and whether there was actually a chargeable offense. I think the government dropped those charges because they're going to come back with a tighter set of charges to answer these motions so that they can basically tighten up their case.
And my understanding also is that the prosecutor, Tiffany Eggers, has been busy with another case. Mm-hmm. This case was very intense, and she's had two wall-to-wall cases. There's been movements in the physical location of the courthouse related to mold and some other occupational health issues. There's budget constraints, which are extremely real, and so, you know, to me, it may have been a combination of circumstances. There was also, I think, that the Free Kent Hovind movement was beginning to diversify, professionalize a bit, and gain some momentum. So some have said that, you know, by this abrupt stop, it might have also sort of taken the wind out of the sails. You know, in looking over the public correspondence of the Free Kent Hovind movement, or the correspondence with each other, do you think that they were surprised at what appeared to be their victory?
I think they were, but I think there are some, I don't know that I would call them cooler heads, but some people who are a little bit more experienced in the ways of the world and the ways of the legal system who have correctly pointed out that the government could come back and within the statute of limitations file those charges again. And as has been pointed out, because they had these briefs from the USJF, the government's charges could be tightened up to avoid those problems, and then that, the vindicators, the people supporting Kent, would be back at square one.
Why is this trial important, if you think it is? Why is this trial important at this stage where we're at politically, where Obama's coming to the end of his term, and it's likely that we'll have a Republican administration? Why is this important in terms of faith-based issues or sovereign citizen issues? Do you feel that the outcome of this trial, aside from its impact on a ministry, has a greater valence?
I think the government was pursuing this really hard, not because of any religious issue, but more because of the sovereign citizen issue. There have been recent surveys of law enforcement. They're very concerned about the rise of sovereign citizens.
Explain the sovereign citizen movement to me, briefly.
Basically, it's an attempt at an alternative legal system that has no correspondence to the American legal system. It uses terms out of the American legal system, but it does not. It doesn't have any correspondence, and it has no connection. So you'll hear people talk about things like courts of record. What is that? It doesn't exist. The only courts we have are the federal and state courts.
Why would law enforcement officials care about some alternative interpretation of the legal system?
Well, it starts out small. It starts out with somebody who says, oh, well, I'm not going to license my car. I'm not going to get a driver's license. That can accelerate pretty quickly, especially since a lot of these guys are armed. There have been incidents where officers have been killed by sovereign citizens because the sovereigns thought that their rights were being encroached upon. It's a very dangerous situation. If I was a cop and I came upon one of these guys with a live free or die and it's not New Hampshire license plate, I'd be a little bit concerned. Some of these guys, when they get pulled over, they have long lists of things that they will insist that they are going to charge the cop. I remember seeing a video on YouTube of a woman who stuck a paper out, and she's like, if you talk to me, it's $300,000. That's simply outrageous, but that's the kind of behavior. Another problem with sovereign citizens is they tend to gum up the legal works. Take, for example, you're a sovereign citizen and you get pulled over by a cop. It's not unheard of for a sovereign citizen to then get very upset at the cop and file a mechanic's lien or other type of lien against them in the county courts, and then do the same with the judge, the prosecutor, all the way down the line, even the poor clerk down at the county courthouse, just because. And then the problem becomes when you try to sell your house. You've got this lien that you've got to remove because nobody is going to write title insurance on that. That's one thing. A lot of states have passed laws against that sort of behavior.
Okay, so quite a number of people I've been talking to in these last few weeks express sympathy for Kent Hovind. He's an older gentleman. He's served X number of years for what they call victimless crime. And, they look at him as, in an affectionate way, kind of hapless. Do you feel that there's any aspects of the Free Kent Hovind movement that have been dangerous, unsavory, or do you think basically it's like any support organization where there's someone in prison, they feel that someone, be they Native American, be they political prisoner, needs some public support and that will help influence policy? Or is there something more going on here that's caused you to take time off of work and observe this trial and spend a considerable amount of time writing about this trial, researching it. So what's going on here, and why is this story important to you personally?
I've always had an interest in sovereign citizens. Of course, that comes from the background in law. And it seems over the last several years, I think particularly since we went through the Great Recession, people have been going for sovereign citizen remedies. Kent Hovind, in my mind, is probably the most prominent sovereign citizen, and he's the only one that I know of that has a dedicated following. Unfortunately, for the Hovindicators, they don't understand why he's in prison.
Sorry, what's a Hovindicator?
A Hovindicator, that's their self-appellation for who they are. They call themselves Hovindicators. It's a combination of Hovind and vindication because they expect to see Kent Hovind vindicated. But what they don't understand about what is happening here is that it's not about religion. It's really not even about the IRS or taxes. It's really about a long-standing process of Kent Hovind for the last 2 decades has pretty much made it clear that he's not under the same legal system as the rest of us. He's acted like a sovereign citizen.
So should we support this or should we condemn this?
I have to come down on the condemn side, unfortunately. I don't have a problem with Kent Hovind the person, and to be perfectly honest, I think prison is a horrible place. I wouldn't wish my worst enemy there because it's an awful, awful place to be. Unfortunately, what do you do with a person who is who doesn't repent, who is going to continue with his activities even if he gets out of prison? I fully expect that when Kent gets out of prison, he is going to run into the same trouble because he has not repented.
Do you blame him for the company he keeps, and what type of company or what type of people have been attracted to the Free Kent Hovind or the Hovindication movement?
I think that's 2 different groups. I think Kent's gone and sought out people in the tax protester and sovereign citizen movement. I think a lot of the Hovindicators, though, are not sovereign citizens, not tax protesters, but do have a strong feeling that the government is persecuting Christians, which I find hard to believe.
So what are we talking about here? Are we talking about religious persecution? Are we talking about the government trying to put a bit of a brake on the sovereign citizen movement and its inroads, its extremist tendencies? Or are we just talking about a plain good old tax evasion, tax delinquency, deadbeat case?
I'm going to totally say that it has nothing to do with persecution. I know that will not win me friends in some quarters, but I simply don't see it. There are other creationists who are out doing their thing, like Ken Ham, and they're doing just fine. They're not having tax problems. I do think it is somewhat related to sovereign citizen activity, and that Kent is being held up as an example because he has been working with people who are somewhat prominent in the sovereign citizen movement. I mean, he worked with Glenn Stoll, who was one of his trustees. Paul Hansen, his co-defendant, is also a sovereign citizen, pretty well known in the Omaha area. But it could also just be a basic garden variety, we are tired of what you are doing. I mentioned earlier about how sovereign citizens like to throw lots of legal papers at the system to try to gum it up. You can see that happening here. Kent filed liens. He was told not to file liens. He filed a lis pendens. That had to be removed from the property. So I tend to be of the opinion that this is trying to be an example to other sovereign citizens of don't do this, we will go after you.
The talking points of the Free Kent Hovind movement have become increasingly pithy and reduced. Basically, guy mails a letter. He's facing life imprisonment. Guy took money from his own bank account. He got 8 years. What's really going on here? Why was Kent Hovind, or is, or was, or will be, facing charges for contempt, conspiracy, and fraud?
Well, he was convicted on the contempt charges, and I believe based on the orders in the case from the judge, that was justified. Having not heard the evidence for the mail fraud case charges, I can't just judge on that yet.
I'm not asking you to judge. I'm asking you to explain what you think Kent Hovind really was being charged with in these last months.
I'm thinking that Kent was being charged with the mail fraud charges, in particular because he was becoming a real annoyance to the U.S. government in trying to settle the 2006 forfeiture case, the $430,500 that he owes from the structuring charges from 2006.
I just interviewed one of the Kent Hovind supporters.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously a person who's fairly sweet and earnest and sincere. She has a autistic son and a lot on her plate, and whether or not you might think it's a bit silly, certainly she did not appear particularly nefarious. Have there been some people involved in this movement who have been less likable?
I don't know about less likable. I try not to dislike people on general principles unless they give me reason to. I think there's some characters. For example, Rudy Davis, he's quite the character. Before Kent Hovind, he was a birther, very much against the idea that Obama could be president, because he was just absolutely convinced that Obama was not a citizen. He had some ideas about how he wanted to be the one to execute Obama. Of course, after the trial, that to me is pretty outrageous, but obviously nothing happened.
Do you think that Kent Hovind deliberately looks for people to bring into his circle whose measures, or at least their talk, is more draconian? Do you think that Kent Hovind likes to be the eccentric sort of genius type and let other people do his thug work? Or do you think it's kind of worked out that way, or at least appears to have, just because of the nature of some of the conspiracy theorist movements and the sovereign citizen movement and so on and so forth?
I think it's a mix. I think that he looks for people who will do his bidding without too much prodding. But I think he's also attracting people. In observing his interactions with Rudy Davis, it's kind of interesting. I think he's found the perfect acolyte, as it were. Rudy's willing to do just about anything for Kent.
Some of the camera crew that the camera can't see that's in front of me have been attacked verbally by Rudy Davis, sometimes by Kent. Some of my production crew who are creationists, some are Baptists, some are homeschool Christians, so we're not talking about the radical left here, have been mentioned repeatedly and critically. Obviously, we all remember when there was thinly veiled, very aggressive death threats or suggestions or recommendations that they die, or whatever you might call it, aimed at the IRS agent, the prosecutor, and the judge. The judge is someone here in Pensacola who works a lot with ex-convicts. Her naturalization ceremonies are very famous, and she's known to be a very even-hand and kind of nurturing personality. Occasionally it gets a little personal for me, and I'm just trying to understand the phenomenon. And I know that there's some that you had your run-in with Scientology, and that kind of what makes this unusual is that the attacks can get very personal, for want of a better term, taunting. So why, in this sort of social movement where they're trying to get people behind releasing someone from prison, why is taunting seemingly part of the methodology?
I think they're trying to set up an us versus them dichotomy. We are the, supporting God's chosen. In this case, that would be Kent Hovind. And the rest of you all out there, even including homeschooled Christians, Baptists, whatever, you're not supporting God's man. It's kind of unusual to think about that because there are a lot of Christians in Pensacola. There are a lot of churches here. And yet, I don't know of a single church in Pensacola that is backing Kent Hovind.
So why does the Free Kent Hovind movement, which I would think would want to curry favor with potential jurors, present a benign face, perhaps a militant, but a relatively benign face to the federal court system, why does it seem to have a personal edge?
I think it's because they really do think that Kent is being persecuted by being in prison for so long for what they consider to be a relatively minor crime, if not even a crime. I mean, they talk constantly about structuring. It bothers me because Kent wasn't just convicted of structuring, he was also convicted of tax crimes for failing to pay income and Social Security taxes for his employees.
Okay, so let's break that down a little bit. So there was the former trial. Mm-hmm. Tell us when that took place, and just very briefly what that was about, and then this fresh set of charges that were just dismissed, and just give a quick summation of both. So why was he really in prison the first time, according to the federal government?
Well, he was convicted on 58 counts. The first 12 were the tax charges I mentioned, where he didn't pay income tax and Social Security for his employees. He claimed they were missionaries, and the government disagreed, and the jury agreed with the government. The next 45 counts were for structuring, and those are the most hotly disputed of the counts. And it's in part because this structuring is not an easy crime to understand in some ways, and partly because when the judge sentenced Kent back in 2007, they had divided the counts up between the tax charges and the structuring charges, and she took the structuring charges as her basis for the 10-year sentence.
Well, what's structuring, and what made Kent Hovind's approach to structuring typical or atypical?
Well, structuring is a crime that is used by the government to try to get at criminals such as drug dealers and such like. It's a crime that does not require you to have the thought in your head that you are going to you're trying to avoid reporting. You just have to do it. It can be very confusing in that way, and recent court cases haven't made it any easier. I have to admit I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around some of the more recent cases.
But basically, what's structuring?
Structuring is where you attempt to keep the government from finding out that you're moving money around. And the threshold is $10,000. Any amount that you withdraw or deposit that is over $10,000, that is reported. What structuring does is people try to move money around in smaller amounts that don't fall into that, so it doesn't get reported.
So did he do this like once?
No, he did it dozens of times. And it wasn't just him, it was his wife, Jo. In fact, she was pretty much the one who did it at his direction.
So, in other words, did they do this regularly for years? Was this their sort of business model?
I think so. I would suspect if I were to actually sit down with a spreadsheet that you could probably track the withdrawals, because these were all withdrawals, with their pay cycles. I'm thinking that that's what happened. And it did stop after a certain point when they started paying their employees with checks.
So, did they make these withdrawals in the amount of $50,000? Did they do it in $1 million? And by not reporting it, does that mean that it's treated as non-taxable?
No, it's just simply that they were withdrawing $9,500 pretty much, sometimes twice a day, sometimes twice a week. It's whenever they needed money. Jo would go in, she'd write a check for $9,500. And it wasn't merely these checks, but also when they did some property transactions, they wrote checks for $30,000 but broke them up into amounts less than $10,000 apiece. They weren't charged for those, but it was used in the trial to show that Kent had this idea in his head that he should not report, or he should not have anything over $10,000 because it would be reported.
You work for a bank,
Mm-hmm.
but the rest of us don't. So when you say, so if it's less than $10,000, who doesn't have to report it? The bank or Kent Hovind?
The bank reports it. The bank will file a report. I mean, these days it's all computerized. They just send it in.
But they won't send it in if it's less than 10,000?
Unless there's something suspicious going on. And believe it or not, that is something that bankers have to watch out for. There's things called know your customer. If a banker or a teller were to notice, you know, hey, she's coming in and she's cashing $5,000 checks, an awful lot, that might raise a red flag. There are also computer programs that pull out these things and they get investigated as well.
So, but by cashing all these $9,500 checks or whatever they were, and in order to ostensibly avoid being reported, does that mean reported to the IRS? Does that mean reported to the banking system? Does that mean not paying taxes on this money? Or is it simply a kind of suspicious type of activity that the federal government or the IRS doesn't like because it sort of partially flies under their radar?
I think it's it partially flies under the government's radar. And one thing you have to be really clear about is that all the money that Kent was bringing in, it was all legit. I mean, it was all money that was coming from donations. It was coming from Dinosaur Adventureland. It was all stuff from sales. He was not getting it through drug deals. He was not smuggling dope, anything like that. It was all legit. The problem is, and this is a huge problem, is that Kent Hovind had a long history of tax evasion. He had started out from like 1989 and basically had not filed a tax return. The IRS had come in 1996 and seized a few of his vehicles to make up tax arrearages for previous years. And after 96, it was a constant tug of war between Kent Hovind and the IRS.
Okay, so you have evangelical, not paying taxes, an old story. what made the Kent Hovind thing more unusual? Did he have? There are celebrities, there are sports figures, and there are missionaries, so on and so forth, who don't pay taxes. But didn't Kent Hovind, in a way, preach the gospel of don't pay your taxes?
He did. He has put out some videos where he had claimed that he had not filed the Form 1040 in 28 years. He told the New York Times in 2003 that he hadn't filed a 1040 in 30 years. In about 1997 or thereabouts, he had even lent part of the Creation Science Evangelism property to a tax protester promoter to make a video. I think that guy's name was Joe Sweet, and I believe he is currently a guest of the Bureau of Prisons. But that's what got Kent in big trouble overall, was that video. Good news for 1040 filers.
Okay, so let's fast forward to the first trial. Conspiracy, fraud, contempt. What was that all about?
You mean the second trial, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It's an outgrowth of the first trial. One of the things that happened at the first trial was that he was convicted on those 45 counts of structuring, and the jury was asked to determine if he should forfeit the $430,500 that he had structured. That was the total amount. The jury decided yes. The government at that point attempted to find assets of Kent and Joe Hovins, they were both convicted on those 45 counts, to satisfy that forfeiture. They didn't find a whole lot, so they went after the 9 parcels that made up Dinosaur Adventure Land and Creation Science Evangelism, and a couple of bank accounts. What we have here, going all the way down, so we're talking 2006, 2007, we're now in 2015, is Kent Hovind very much did not want his property sold, and so he attempted to try to hold on to it in any way possible by filing liens, and then a particular type of lien called a lis pendens.
We'll get into lis pendens in a moment, but if I'm not mistaken, weren't the bulk of the property sold at very inexpensive prices to his family members, his in-laws, his wife, his son? Why did the IRS, in auctioning off this property or preparing to, sell it back to mostly the family members?
He told them to buy it. Long story short, Kent told his family, "You will get that property back." And as part of the way of getting that property back, he filed liens to basically scare others off.
But in selling it to family members, doesn't the government, when they sell off assets, put stuff out to auction, put it in the newspaper? Why did agents Chuck Evans and Scott Schneider offer it first to Kent Hovind's family? Was that an act of kindness and charity and on the part of the IRS, or they were ready buyers?
They were ready buyers. They were absolutely intent on getting that property back. I don't think the government was looking to sell it to the Hovind family first, and in fact we know that with one piece of property the Hovinds did not get it back, and that was the property that was sold to Anthony Jaworski.
Okay, so the family got some of it because they just were batter up first or whatever reason. Not necessarily that the IRS was all that sympathetic to the family. One had served federal time. Jaworski, who we interviewed, got another piece and seems to regret it with every ounce of his soul. And how much is left?
I believe we're down to 4 parcels.
4 parcels left?
4 parcels left that need to be sold. I do not know, I have not figured out the amount of money that's left. One thing that has to be kept in mind is that Judge Rogers very clearly ordered that they could only sell one parcel at a time, apply it to the balance owed, and if any parcels were remaining after they paid the complete balance, those were to go back to the Hovens. That would be Kent and Joe.
So why didn't he just let the process play itself out?
I don't know. I've kind of got it in my head that he thinks of that property as his, as some sort of Dino Holy Land. It's as good an explanation as any.
You were not at the last trial, but
And I really regret that.
but there was lots of information available about that trial from various people's writings, from blogs, from lots of detail contained in the denial motions filed by the government side. So what's your basic opinion of the conspiracy and fraud thing? Did Glenn Stoll and Hansen, were they running a legitimate trust on behalf of Creation Science Evangelism?
Based on what
I'm asking you as a lawyer.
No, and I'll tell you why. And this is not my opinion. This is from Judge Rogers' opinion, 2009 opinion, I believe. She pointed out that Glenn Stoll did not have full control of the property. If you're a trustee, you should be able to do all sorts of things to the property. You should be able to sell it without anybody doing anything. You should be paying the taxes on it. If you're leasing the property, you should be the lessor, the person that's signing on the dotted line with your renter. None of that was happening.
Was that happening under Hansen?
No, not that I know of.
So, so if they were your clients back in the days when you were practicing law, would you say, "Hey, there's something wrong with this trust"?
I would have told them flatly, "Don't even buy this trust." Glenn Stoll was selling these ministerial trusts as a tax dodge, and I would have flatly said, "You are crazy." And then I would have said, here, let me get you somebody who handles, 501c3 organizations. They can get you set up right.
And was Hansen an upgrade from Glenn Stoll as the new trustee?
I don't know that he was an upgrade or not. I think for what they were intending to do, they were both fairly incompetent.
Hansen again and again referred to the fact that there were other trustees that were basically calling the shots, and he wasn't making the decisions, the major decisions. Perhaps the most bizarre aspect of the last trial was that Hansen couldn't remember their first names. What's up with that? Do you have any idea?
I don't know, and I heard that, and I found that was very, very interesting. You would think that you would know the names of your fellow trustees in case you needed to, call a meeting because you needed to sell the property or you needed to make a decision as to whether to rent it to somebody or whatever. The fact that he didn't know the names of the other trustees indicates to me really very clearly that it was a sham trust.
Do you think that Ken Hovind knew what was going on with his property and some of his other business dealings while he was in prison?
Yes. I think the guy's a micromanager.
So in much the same way as a gang leader or a mafia figure or a businessman or businesswoman who's imprisoned, they have their ways of getting information in and out. So Hovind, in terms of his management style, liked to know things that were going on. Do you think that he pretty much knew what was happening at all times?
Absolutely. There's one government document. Kent asked for his charges to be dismissed, and the government filed a rebuttal and brought forward some of the evidence that came out at the most recent trial. Kent was pretty much telling his son Eric and his son-in-law Paul Dublin what to do. He told Eric, "You need to give money, you need to give the specific amount to Paul Hansen. You know, different separate times. You need to give Paul money. Do. He ordered Paul Dublin to take the list pendants down and get those filed. He was definitely running the show.
Based on the excerpts of the phone conversations, snippets from emails and from handwritten and typed letters, what was your impression from someone who had been looking at Hovind for a long time of his conduct? Would you term it to be fraudulent, conspiratorial, and contemptful, or basically someone just looking after their interests? What's your real opinion?
I think Kent sees himself as looking after his own interests. I, on the other hand, see it as somewhat excessive. I mean, he really is a micromanager. One of the things that he talks about, that is talked about in that rebuttal brief, is how much he wants to be in control of creation science evangelism, which has now become Creation Today. I mean, he pretty much had an argument with Eric, his son, over who was running the show, and it was his feeling, Kent's feeling, that when he got out of prison that he was just going to come back in and take it over, and I don't think that that's what Eric wants to see happen.
Tell us a bit about your backstory. Is there a reason why you're particularly sensitive to the sort of campaign that the Free Kent Hovind campaign has been from time to time?
Yeah, actually, for the last 2 decades, I've been one of the vocal opponents of the Church of Scientology, and as a result, I have my own personal website where they take me apart on the internet. Back in the 90s, it was kind of a scary thought, because you didn't know what people would think. The web was still fairly new and that sort of thing. Today, it looks downright prescient. I send people to that site so they can get a good giggle and see some really old pictures of me.
So what happened there?
What happened there? I was picketing them. Occasionally, they picketed me. One time, they plastered signs around my neighborhood. That kind of backfired when a radio talk show host saw them and invited me on her show.
So what is that experience of being harassed and also your experience in harassing? What does that have to do with Kent Hovind? Anything at all, or are they just two separate chapters in your history?
I think they're two separate chapters in my history. I see Scientology as a real and present danger, continue to, and it just makes my heart happy to see that their antics have gotten the attention of documentary filmmakers and news people these days. As for Kent Hovind, he attracts my attention because he is probably the most prominent sovereign citizen out there, and he has a following. But, it's, as I've explained to some of his followers, it's not about his religion, or it's not about the dinos, basically. It's about the taxes, and more importantly, it's about the sovereign citizen aspect of it.
Have any of the Free Kent Hovind people been critical of you for your legal analysis and reporting and commentary on Kent Hovind's legal troubles?
Oh, I've been called Jezebel. I had a couple of days ago, somebody made a nasty comment about the gap in my front teeth, which is hereditary. I just find that amusing. It's like, what? You don't have anything substantive? You're going after my teeth?
And is there a corollary? I mean, does that remind you of your run-ins with Scientology, or is it a completely different feel? Is it apples and oranges?
It's apples and oranges because even though they called me Jezebel, no follower of Kent Hovind has come down to Arizona and plastered my neighborhood with signs. No follower of Kent Hovind has, I mean, seriously, it is. I wouldn't say it's apples and oranges. It's, by comparison, it's not a whole lot.
Okay. So tomorrow morning you're going to court, federal court here in Pensacola, and what do you expect will happen?
I'm thinking it's going to be dull. What I think is going to happen is I imagine that Judge Rogers might be a tiny bit upset with the prosecution for yanking the trial at the last minute. She probably is going to be a little bit upset with the defense attorneys for filing untimely motions, the ones that provoked the prosecution in dropping the charges. But it's going to be, I think, a fairly short hearing. I really don't expect a whole lot out of it. I would love to be surprised.
And do you think that we'll come out of the courtroom tomorrow knowing more about what motivated the prosecution to dismiss the charges really at the 11th hour?
I don't know that we're going to know a whole lot more about why they did. I think what we will need to wait for is for them to refile their charges, and then we can sit down and compare the wording. I know that sounds really nitpicky, but comparing the wording of the old charges to the new charges.
And what impact, if any, will this have on the sentencing date when, I believe it was June 12th, when Kent Hovind is supposed to be sentenced for his contempt of court charges?
I don't think that's going to move. I think they're going to go ahead with the sentencing, and I'll tell you why. It's not so much Kent, but Paul. He's approaching, he's been in jail for several months. Depending on the length of the sentence he has, he may be, if he gets a year, he may be pretty close to being done. So I don't know.
But the Free Kent Hovind movement keeps talking about 20 years and so on and so forth. Where does that come from?
If you're convicted of mail fraud, you can get 20 years. I believe you can also receive a 20-year sentence for criminal contempt of court.
Is that common?
No.
What's common?
In this case, I would say probably 2 or 3 years, maybe. And, judges have a lot of leeway. It's going to really depend on the sentencing report.
What's the sentencing report?
It's something that is prepared by the government to give the judge some guidance on how to go. It's fairly complicated. I looked at sentencing reports. Basically, they have a level, and then they move up or down depending on whether you've do you have any previous convictions, things like that. And then the judge can work within a certain range.
So you're telling me that unlike sort of the impression that we get from the Free Kent Hovind movement, the judge does not have as much latitude or subjective power as perhaps we think in terms of the length of sentence that she imposes?
I think so, and I'll tell you why. It's because any sentence that she imposes can be appealed as being excessive. And then, if the 11th Circuit doesn't like it, they can kick it back and say, try again.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and we'll see what happens tomorrow morning.
Great.
Thank you.